But yeah, Trinitarian glory and grace this morning again from Ephesians chapter 1. I started saying a moment ago that if you think I've been a little bit fixated with Ephesians, you'll be right. But in actual fact, part of the reason for this is that this chapter is the most beautiful, but also complex. It is filled with just these insights and absolute gems. And in actual fact, this beginning part, verse 3 to 14, that I've been sharing the past couple of weeks, is an introduction to the whole letter. And so much of what Paul shares is found in the rest of the letter. So by focusing on this introduction, it's almost like plunging us into Paul's thought for the Christians, the church in Ephesus and wider. The letter to the Ephesians is thought to be a circular letter. So although we have particularly this copy that was written to the Ephesians, it was intended for the wider church. And in actual fact, it shows much of Paul's thinking and his theology of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and all that God has done for us. So as I said, it's just packed with these loaded terms, these gems, these phrases that kind of continue to wind around one another. There's the swirl of moving on and then relating back to what he's already said. In the original Greek, verses 3 to 14 is in fact one long sentence. It starts with, blessed God, blessed be God, and it ends with, to the praise of his glory. And so this morning I wanted to focus on a couple of these P's, praise and purpose and perhaps power. But I think given some of what I was looking at, we'll probably just land on the praise and the purpose. So a few weeks back, we shared, or I started this whole incursion into Ephesians. We did Philippians with Paul's prayer. This is kind of what kicked me off. And we looked at that and we said that Paul prays there and leads us to pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, would give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation to know him in a deep and an intimate way, that the eyes of your heart would be enlightened so that you would know the hope of his calling for you, his glorious inheritance in the saints, and the all-surpassing greatness of his power to us who believe. So even there, we see that Paul immediately prays, and he's praying that you would know this hope of his calling. He's praying that we would know this sense of inheritance. But right there, he prays to the Father of glory. And in fact, it's interesting because glory in the Hebrew is a word that speaks of the majesty, the awesomeness of God. But the word simply implies weight. It's a weighty word, and it speaks of the weight of God, the character of God. And so this word glory in Ephesians, just again, like that atom, it seems to swirl around and relate back to what Paul is saying. So we've seen that God calls us out. He delivered us. He redeemed us. We looked at that last week. And this blessing of the beginning, in actual fact, evokes praise. The response to what God has done for us, his deliverance, and the response to who God is in fact praise. But it's almost more than that. It's a calling. It's a purpose. Our purpose is to praise and to give him glory. So 3 times in this section of Paul's introduction, 3 times here he uses this word, to the praise of his glory. We are called to the praise of his glory. So in verse 4 and 5, he says that he called us to himself before the foundation of the world, to be holy and blameless before him in love, having predestined us to adoption. We've been looking at that through Jesus Christ. It pleased him. It was to his good pleasure, to the praise of his glorious grace. And then he goes on and he says a similar thing in verse 11. He says, in whom we've been we've been set apart, having again been predestined according to the purpose of the one who works all things according to the counsel of his will, to be to the praise of his glory. We've been adopted. We have been set aside. Literally, that word means to be chosen by lot. We have been appointed to be to the praise of his glory. And then amazingly, this whole introduction, in fact, ends off with the same phrase. His introduction, as I said, starts with blessed God, and then it ends with to the praise of his glory. So Paul, in fact, is praying and calling us to pray with him that the eyes of our heart would be enlightened so that we would know the hope to which he's called us. And another word that keeps feeding into this glorious praise, in fact, is grace. So in a few verses, another one that I wanted to share, going back to verse 4, he says there that just as he called us to himself before the foundation of the world, we read, he said, to the praise of his glorious grace. And that verse ends with, which he graced us with in the beloved. This glorious God has done so much for us. He's incredibly blessed us and overflown in blessing to us. But to the praise of his glorious grace, which he graced us with. A lot of the translations don't, in fact, say it. They use a different synonym. But the word repeats itself. It's this alliteration that you see in the text. Glorious grace, which he then graces us with. And in fact, one of the favorite verses that I was just looking at, again, is this one, where he continues on into verse 7 and 8, where he talks about redemption, forgiveness that we looked at specifically last week. And again, all this deliverance through his blood that Christ purchased for us is according to the richness, the riches of his grace. And then again, Paul uses, I said to you at the beginning, there's this continual flow, the swirling, this movement of these words and verses. He graces us with grace. And now literally the word is, he pours out. I love the one translation, he lavished it upon us. So this, in fact, is the thing that I keep thinking of and going back to, that God somehow continues to grace us and grace us with his grace, with his glorious grace, with his glory. And then the riches, the absolute riches of his grace, that he says that you would know the riches, the hope of your inheritance, that we would know what God's done for us, he's praying. And then before that, he's saying, but he has lavished this upon us. So that was one of the things that was sitting with me. I've been praying a bit about it this week. It leads me into worship, but it leads me to pray. and to think of us, to think of you, and to say, do we really know how much, how rich we are in what God has done? The riches of his grace, the glory of his grace, which through Jesus, he has literally poured into us and poured over us. He's lavished it upon us. I have my screen open in front of me, so I can't see everyone, but it's almost wanting to ask, I know some of the avid briars in our midst, John and Johnny, was wondering if perhaps they'd managed to braai in this cold front of the last few weeks. We certainly haven't ventured out much in this house, and certainly not to braai. But it almost, the sense I was thinking of that I thought Johnny would love is just being marinated. It's like God just marinates us in the riches of his grace that he's poured out upon us. So this glorious God, this glorious grace. And the last point I want to make is about glorious purpose. I started off saying, and I know I've been saying it the last few weeks, that our response to everything that Paul's talking about, our response is worship. Our response is awe. Our response is wonder. But quite literally, when we come to say, what is our purpose in this inheritance? What is our purpose as a result of what Christ has done for us? That phrase that reverbs through this passage, to the praise of his glory. The one phrase, in actual fact, in the Greek is what they call a purpose clause. And literally, what Paul is saying there, the way it's constructed, is that we would be in order. The purpose is for us to be to the praise of his glory. And that's quite incredible. So literally, our purpose for all of us, we can all think of individual purpose and calling and how God is using each of us. But in a huge umbrella way, in a general sense, God has lavished us with all that he's done for us in order that we would be to the praise of his glory. So, as I said before, he's blessed us. He's overflown in blessing to us. And this calls us to two other ways that people talk about it, is worship and mission. The one is worship, we respond in worship, but it's more than that. It's a calling to a lifestyle of worship, a lifestyle of we are living to give him praise, to give him glory. And in that sense as well, it's worship and mission, because as God has overflown in blessing, we are called to live in a way that does the same. We mirror what God has done to us. He's lavished grace upon us, and we meant to live in that grace in a way that we share it with others. We share his blessing. As we've been blessed, we get to be a blessing. So again, on this purpose and this word glory, God is glory. He's a glorious God. It describes who he is, but it also talks about what he's shared with us. Glory is the Genesis story. Glory is the garden. God has called us to glory, and he shared his glory with us. We see this in 1 John. One of the ancient ways that the church gave voice to this was through the Westminster Confession. And the shorter confession is phrased in these questions. And the question is, what is the chief end of man? Old translation should be humanity. But the chief end of humanness, The chief end of this deliverance, this redemption, is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. You know that I've shared this so many times. One of my favorite early church fathers is St. Irenaeus. And my favorite quote from him is, "The glory of God is the human being fully alive." The glory of the garden, the glory of the cross, is that God gets to deliver us, capture us. The words Paul keeps using, adopt us, call us out of the world, the slavery, the sin, the things that we get entangled in. God calls us out of that to himself. We don't just get to say we're blessed and adopted and we stay there. We get to say he has freed us for a purpose. Quite simply, you can't say it any more simply than this. He's freed us to be free. And that freedom is to live as we were created to live well, to live alive, to live a life that is to the praise of his glory, to live a life that praises him, gives him glory. There's a song by R.E.M. We used to play R.E.M. a lot in the car. Girls used to enjoy it, but there's a song, I love the words, and they didn't coin the phrase, but it says, "Living well is the best revenge." So for the Israelites, as they went through the Red Sea, as they were delivered into the promised land, the best revenge against slavery and Pharaoh, well, Pharaoh got his just deserves, but the best revenge was to live in the promise, in the inheritance of God, to live well. And that's the same for us. He has adopted us. He has delivered us by his blood. We don't pause there. The best revenge is to live well. And so in that way, there's a general sense of purpose and calling in what Paul is talking about. We live free. We live as God always intended us to live. And that means to live well with him, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, with all our strength. Jesus' words, Jesus' summary of the law. The way to live well is to live deeply, passionately, fully alive before God, to God, flowing back to him in praise, not just in a song that we sing a couple of times a week, but in our whole life. And then to live well with one another. What gives God glory is, in a sense, when his children live well. And so we love one another as we have been loved, as we love God. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself, as Jesus said. Interestingly, lots of thoughts we shared last week about slavery and some of the protests around Black Lives Matter. And it's just been fascinating in the last few weeks to just see what's happening around the world and on social media, things like that. In fact, I'd have thought at the beginning of the outbreak of this pandemic, there seemed to be a moment, and it was only for a few moments, but there seemed to be a moment where humanity was united in our humanness. It was humanity against a pandemic. And it didn't matter if, we were looking at what was happening at that stage. It was China, and then it was Italy, and then it was Spain, and then it was us. But there was such a sense in which there was a commonality of it's just humanity. And well, that hasn't gone so well, particularly in the US. I watched an interview this week where The president referred to COVID-19 as the Chinese pandemic. And again, we'll pause there, but children get to misbehave. But the race riots, the TJF talk that we did, we realize again that there is only one race. It's the human race. There is humanity created in God's image. God created us to share his glory with us. He created us to live well in a way that gives him glory. And part of that is to live well with one another. As he overflowed in blessing to us, we are called to share the riches of his grace, the way he has blessed us with others. And again, as Paul says, there's no Jew, no Greek, no male, nor female, no slave, nor free. There is one calling to humanness. The glory of God is a human being, fully alive.